The morning my life was stolen from me, I almost put on my red shoes. They were sitting by the door, polished from a Sunday I barely remembered, and for a moment I stood there staring at them, as if they could answer the question that had been circling my mind since 4:12 a.m. Why did a stranger knock on my door before dawn just to tell me not to go to work? The apartment was still dark, the kind of dark that makes every sound feel louder than it is. The refrigerator hummed like it was trying to keep a secret. The air smelled faintly of the lavender detergent I used on my sheets. And my heart beat so hard it felt like it was knocking back at the door he had just left. His name was Julian Thorne. I knew that much because he had introduced himself weeks earlier in the elevator, his voice low and polite, his eyes always scanning the hallway like he expected something to be wrong. He lived across the corridor. We had never spoken more than 3 sentences at a time. And yet, at 4 in the morning, he had stood outside my apartment and said, "Elena, please, don't go to work today. No explanation, no drama, just urgency wrapped in quiet manners." I remember the way his knuckles looked pale against my wooden door, the way his jaw tightened as if he were holding back more words than he was giving me. And then he had walked away before I could even form a proper question. I should have laughed it off. I should have shaken my head and gone back to sleep. But grief makes you listen to strange things. My father had been buried 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks since I had stood beside a mahogany casket, inhaling the smell of roses and polished wood, trying to accept that the man who used to fix my bicycle with oil-stained fingers was now a photograph in a black frame. Since his death, my world had felt tilted, like a painting slightly off-center that no one bothered to straighten. So I didn't put on the red shoes. I sat at the edge of my bed with my work blouse folded on my lap, and felt a weight in my chest that I couldn't name. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the silence before thunder, a pressure in the air that tells you something is about to split open. I texted my supervisor at 6:03 a.m., fingers trembling more than they should have. "I'm not feeling well. I need a personal day." The lie tasted bitter, but not as bitter as the unease that had settled into my stomach. Before all of this, my life had been painfully ordinary. Comfortably ordinary. 8. I worked in administrative coordination at a mid-sized research firm downtown, the kind of job where you learn the rhythms of printers and coffee machines better than you learn the people. I was good at schedules, at color, coded spreadsheets, at remembering birthdays no one else remembered. My desk had a small cactus and a framed photo of my father holding a fishing rod he never actually used. Evenings were simple. I would stop by the corner bakery where the bell chimed too loudly and buy a loaf of bread that still smelled warm. I would call my aunt on Tuesdays. I would water the fern on the balcony and watch the city lights flicker on like tired stars. My world was not grand, but it was stable. And stability is a kind of luxury you don't recognize until it's gone. My father used to say, "Peace is not loud, Lena." That's how you know it's real. He had been a private man, methodical, always writing notes in small black notebooks he never let me read. After he died, I found dozens of them tucked into drawers and boxes, but most were filled with mundane things: grocery lists, measurements, reminders to call the plumber. Only once did I find a page that unsettled me. It had a single phrase written across the top in capital letters: Aegis. No explanation, no context, just that word, underlined twice. I remember running my thumb over the indentation of the pen marks, feeling the pressure he must have used, and wondering why that word looked angrier than the rest. I put the notebook away. Some questions, I thought, were better left where the dead had placed them. That morning staying home felt wrong and right at the same time. The sunlight crept through the blinds in thin golden lines that warmed the carpet inch by inch. I made coffee. I didn't drink. I turned on the television only to mute it. My phone lay beside me like an object waiting to explode. At 9:17 a.m., it did. My coworker Marissa called, her voice sharp with panic. "Elena, where are you?" "At home," I said, confused. "I told Mr. Hahn I wasn't feeling well." There was a pause, a long one. I could hear sirens through her end of the line, distant but real. You're at home," she repeated. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause. Heavier this time. There's been an incident. Security's everywhere. They're saying you came in early. I laughed then, a small nervous sound. Marissa, I just woke up an hour ago. No, Elena, she whispered. They have footage. Your keycard logged at 5:02 mm. My fingers went cold. Truly cold, like I had touched ice. That's not possible. I know, she said quickly. I know. But they're asking for you. The call ended, and the apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the air thinner. I stared at my keycard hanging on the hook by the door, its plastic surface catching a sliver of sunlight. It hadn't moved. I hadn't moved. Yet somewhere in the city, a version of me had apparently walked into my office before dawn. I don't remember deciding to stand. I was just suddenly on my feet, pacing, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The smell of coffee had turned sour. My father's photo on the shelf seemed to watch me with a seriousness I had never noticed before. A knock came again. Not frantic, not loud. Just 3 steady taps. I knew it was Julian before I opened the door. He stood there in the same dark jacket, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softer than they had been at dawn. In his hand was a folded newspaper, though he didn't offer it to me. You stayed home, he said quietly. Yes, I answered, my throat dry. Why are people saying I went to work? He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he had been carrying all night. Because someone needs you to have been there. I felt irritation rise through my fear. What does that even mean? His gaze shifted past me into my apartment, noticing the cactus, the mug, the ordinary life laid out in plain sight. Something like regret flickered across his face. It means, he said, your father was right. The words hit me harder than any accusation could have. My father, I repeated. You didn't even know him. Julian looked back at me then, and for the first time since I had met him, he seemed human. Not guarded, not distant. Just tired. I knew him well enough to promise I'd watch over you, he said. The hallway light buzzed faintly above us. Somewhere downstairs, a dog barked. My world, my small, predictable, neatly labeled world, began to feel like a stage set made of painted cardboard. Watch over me from what? I asked. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I understood something terrible and irreversible. My ordinary life had not been broken by accident. It had been rearranged on purpose. Julian didn't step inside right away. He stood at my doorway like a man asking permission to enter a memory that didn't belong to him. I realized then that he wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid for me. There is a difference, and you feel it in the shoulders. Fear of someone tightens the jaw. Fear for someone softens the eyes. I can't explain everything in a hallway, he said. My first instinct was to refuse him. Every warning I'd ever been given about strangers, every true crime podcast I'd half listened to while washing dishes, every headline about trust gone wrong, all of it rose to the surface. But grief has a way of bending rules. Loneliness bends them further, and confusion breaks them entirely. I stepped aside. He entered quietly, as if he didn't want his shoes to disturb the air. His gaze moved across the apartment again, slower this time, lingering on the photograph of my father. His expression shifted, not surprised. That unsettled me more than anything he had said. I folded my arms. Start talking. Julian remained standing. Your father believed someone would try to use you after he died. I laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow, like a glass tapped with a spoon. Use me for what? I schedule meetings, Julian. I alphabetize files. You think that's all you are because that's all you've been allowed to be, he replied gently. The sentence hung between us like dust in sunlight. Aloud, the word irritated me. My father had raised me to be independent, stubborn even. No one allowed me to be anything. He was paranoid toward the end, I said, my voice tightening. He wrote strange things in notebooks. He barely slept. Paranoia is often just knowledge without proof. I hated how calm he sounded. I hated that he didn't sound like a conspiracy theorist or a lunatic. He sounded like a man delivering news he wished were untrue. My phone buzzed again on the table. 3 messages from Marissa. 2 missed calls from an unknown number. A news alert notification previewed across the screen. Meyer Tate early morning breach at Helix Research. Employee identified. My stomach dropped. The room tilted, the way it had the day I identified my father's body at the hospital. That strange sensation where gravity seems to forget its job. He didn't need to. He already knew what happened at my office, I whispered. A controlled incident, he said. Not random, not emotional. Designed for what? My voice cracked. For paperwork. For blame. The word landed heavier than any accusation Marissa could have given me. Blame meant intention. Blame meant planning. Blame meant someone had drawn my name like a target on a board and decided it was convenient. I sank into the chair beside the small kitchen table. The wood felt cold through my thin pajamas. The apartment suddenly smelled like stale coffee and metal, a scent I only noticed when my nerves were on edge. Who would do that? I asked. Julian finally sat across from me, leaning his forearms on his knees. The same people your father spent the last year trying to expose. I thought of the notebooks, the late-night phone calls he would take on the balcony, speaking in half sentences. The way he had begun locking doors that had never been locked before. I had assumed grief from my mother's earlier passing had finally caught up to him. I had assumed age had sharpened his caution. Assumptions are comfortable. Truth rarely is. What people? I pressed. He hesitated again, and I realized his pauses were not from uncertainty but from calculation, choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. An initiative, he said. A project that exists behind companies you've heard of but never questioned. They call it Aegis. The name crawled across my skin like a cold insect. I saw the notebook page in my mind, the thick underlines, the pressure of ink. My father's handwriting had always been neat, almost gentle. That page had looked angry. He wrote that word, I murmured. Julian's gaze lifted to meet mine. I know. Silence settled, dense and heavy. Outside, a car horn blared, then faded. Somewhere in the building a door slammed. Life continued its ordinary rhythm, while mine quietly unraveled at the seams. What does Aegis have to do with me? I asked. Everything, he answered. I shook my head immediately, instinctively. No, I'm not important. I'm not you are important enough to be framed, he said softly. Important enough for someone to risk a public incident to put your face on the news before noon. My throat tightened. I thought of my aunt, who watched morning television religiously. I thought of former classmates scrolling through headlines on their phones. I imagined my own name spoken by anchors with serious expressions. A life can be ruined without a single courtroom if the story is told loudly enough. I didn't do anything, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I know. 3 simple words. And somehow they steadied me more than any reassurance from friends ever had. Because he didn't say them like comfort. He said them like fact. I stood and walked to the sink, rinsing an already clean mug just to have something to do with my hands. The water ran too loudly. My reflection in the small window above the faucet looked older than it had yesterday. When did you start watching me? I asked without turning around. 6 months ago. I dried the mug slowly. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were safe then, he replied. And because your father insisted your normal life remain normal as long as possible. I turned. You're telling me my father hired you? Stationed, he corrected. He believed proximity would matter one day. The word stationed made him sound like a guard placed outside a vault. And the realization crept in with uncomfortable clarity. I had been living next to my protection without knowing I needed protection. My eyes drifted back to the key card hanging by the door. A simple piece of plastic. Ordinary, replaceable. Yet somewhere across the city, its digital echo had apparently walked through security gates I had never touched. How could they use my card if it never left here? I asked. Julian's jaw tightened. Because identity is easier to duplicate than people think. I felt anger rise then, not explosive, but simmering, the kind that sits low in your chest like hot tea. Someone had not only staged an incident, they had borrowed my existence to do it. They had worn my name like clothing. What do they want? I asked. Julian leaned back slightly, studying me with a seriousness that felt almost apologetic. You. The word was quiet. Final. Like the closing of a book you didn't realize you were reading. I let out a breath. I didn't know I'd been holding. A strange calm followed. Not peace, but clarity. The kind you feel when a storm finally shows its shape instead of hiding behind clouds. For what? I whispered. His answer came slower this time, heavier. Because you are something they lost control of. I stared at him, waiting for elaboration, for explanation, for anything that made sense in the world I understood. But sense had already begun to slip through my fingers like sand. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my aunt's name flashing across the screen. I didn't answer. Because in that moment I realized the life I had woken up with that morning. The quiet apartment, the bakery bread, the red shoes, had already begun to disappear. Not dramatically. Not with fire or sirens, but with headlines, whispers, and careful planning done in rooms I had never entered. Julien rose from his chair. You need to see something, he said. What? Something your father left for you. I looked around my small apartment, at the cactus, the photograph, the half-washed mug. Ordinary things suddenly felt like relics of a life already archived. Where? I asked. His answer was simple. Below your feet, and for the first time since dawn, true fear, sharp and undeniable, finally found me. I thought he meant the basement. That's the funny thing about fear. It makes you interpret danger in the most practical way first. I imagined dusty storage lockers, flickering lights, the smell of mold and old paint. My mind clung to the ordinary because the ordinary felt survivable, but Julien didn't move toward the door. He walked instead to the small hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom, the place where the floorboard had always creaked no matter how carefully I stepped. I had complained about that creak to my father once, years ago. He had smiled in that distracted way of his and said, "Some sounds are meant to stay." Julien knelt and pressed his palm against the wood. A soft click answered him. I felt my breath leave my body. The plank lifted slightly, not dramatically, not like in movies, just enough to reveal a thin metal seam beneath it. He slid his fingers under the edge and pulled. The panel came up smoothly, revealing a narrow hatch I had never noticed, though I had lived above it for 4 years. 4 years. I had vacuumed that hallway hundreds of times. I had walked over it in socks and heels, with grocery bags digging into my fingers. And all along, there had been a door under my feet. I don't understand, I whispered. You weren't meant to, Julien replied. The hatch opened into a ladder descending into dim light. Not darkness, dim light. That detail unnerved me more than if it had been pitch black. Darkness is natural underground. Light means preparation. The air rising from below smelled faintly of metal and paper, not damp, not stale. Maintained. My father's presence suddenly felt closer than it had at his funeral. Did he build this? I asked. With help, Julien said. I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered weekends when my father said he had errands, the extra keys on his ring, the tiredness that never matched his daily routine, a lifetime of small mysteries aligning into one large truth. I descended first. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me already knew whatever was down there belonged to me more than to Julien. The ladder was cool under my palms. My heartbeat echoed softly against the metal walls as I stepped onto a concrete floor lit by a single overhead strip of white light. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small studio apartment, but it was organized with a precision that made my chest tighten. Tupnish Kameming. Tupnish Kameming. Shelves lined the walls, filled with binders, labeled boxes, sealed envelopes. A desk stood in the corner with a computer monitor covered by a cloth. A faint scent of ink and cardboard hung in the air. My father's handwriting was everywhere. Labels in black marker. Dates, initials, arrows drawn with impatient strokes. The room didn't feel secretive in a criminal way. It felt protective. Like a vault made not to hide wrongdoing but to preserve truth. My fingers brushed the edge of a binder labeled 7B. I pulled my hand back instinctively, as if it might burn me. Julien descended behind me, his footsteps controlled and quiet. He wanted you to find this only if something went wrong, Something clearly did, I murmured. I walked slowly along the shelves, reading fragments, project codes, medical terminology I barely understood, newspaper clippings about corporate mergers and research grants. The ordinary world layered over something far less ordinary. It was like seeing the scaffolding behind a finished building. At the center of the desk lay a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's careful script. Elena. My knees weakened slightly. I sat in the chair before opening it, the paper trembling between my fingers. The letter inside was short, painfully short. Painfully short. If you are reading this, then I failed to keep you outside of it. I am sorry for the life I could not explain. You are not their creation. You are their fear. Remember that. Trust the man across the hall. Dad. I read it 3 times. Each time the words rearranged themselves in my mind, but the meaning stayed the same. You are not their creation. You are their fear. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely audible. Julian moved closer to the shelves and removed the binder marked 7B. He placed it on the desk with a weight that felt ceremonial. It means, he said, they studied you before you ever knew they existed. I opened the binder slowly. Photographs, medical charts, dates stretching back into my childhood, blood tests I didn't remember taking, school records, immunization. My entire life documented in sterile detail, stripped of emotion. I saw my own face at age 9, smiling with a missing tooth, at 16, holding a debate trophy, at 23, standing beside my father at a workbench. I felt exposed, not physically, personally, as if someone had been reading my diary without my permission for decades. This is illegal, I whispered. It's invisible, Julian corrected. That's worse. I turned a page and found a term circled repeatedly, subject 7B. My mouth went dry. That's me. Yes, the room felt smaller. I traced the printed letters with my fingertip, grounding myself in their physical presence. Subject, as if I were a topic in a study, not a person with favorite songs and grocery lists and half-finished novels on my nightstand. What did they want from me? I asked. Julian's answer came with reluctance. Observation at first, then retrieval. Retrieval. The word sounded clinical, like recalling a defective product. Control. He clarified gently. Ownership. A bitter laugh escaped me. I'm not ownable. That's exactly the problem, he said. I turned another page. Chart showed unusual immune responses, rapid healing notes from minor injuries I barely remembered, a bicycle fall that had scarred and faded within weeks, a childhood illness that lasted a single day when doctors expected 7. Small anomalies I had dismissed as luck or resilience. You're telling me my body is different. I'm telling you your father discovered they couldn't replicate what you naturally are. Naturally. The words soothed and terrified me at the same time. I wasn't manufactured. I wasn't engineered. I was simply me. And somehow, that had made me valuable to people who measured value in control. I closed the binder slowly. My reflection in the dark computer screen showed a woman I recognized but didn't fully know anymore. They framed me at work to bring me out into the open, I said, piecing it together. To make me run. To isolate you, Julian added. When the world believes you're guilty, you lose allies before you even ask for help. I thought of my aunt's missed calls, Marissa's frightened voice. The news alert, my reputation dissolving before noon like sugar in hot tea. Anger returned, steadier this time. Not panic, purpose. What did my father find that scared them enough to do this? I asked. Julian reached for the covered monitor and lifted the cloth. Dust floated briefly in the air before settling. He pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the room with a pale blue glow. Proof, he said, and a choice he believed only you could make. The computer loaded slowly. I could hear my own breathing. The hum of the machine, the faint buzz of the overhead light. A single folder appeared on the desktop. Aegis, final. My finger hovered over the mouse. In that moment, I understood something with quiet certainty. The woman who had almost worn red shoes that morning was gone. Not destroyed, just transformed by knowledge she never asked for but could no longer ignore. I clicked, and the truth opened like a door that had been waiting for me my entire life. The first file was a video. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until Julian gently said, "You can breathe, Elena." Only then did my lungs remember their purpose. My finger trembled over the trackpad before I pressed play. The screen flickered once, twice, and then my father appeared, older than the photo on my shelf, thinner, his hair more silver than I remembered. He was sitting at this very desk, the same light above him, the same shelves behind him. A ghost recorded before he became one. "Lena," he began, and my name sounded different in his voice, not spoken across a dinner table, not called from another room, but preserved, deliberate. "If you're watching this, then I couldn't stop them in time." My throat tightened. I reached for the edge of the desk to steady myself. "I need you to understand something," he continued. "You were never an experiment. You were a discovery. And discoveries frighten people who build their power on predictability." He paused, rubbing his temple the way he used to when he was choosing his words carefully. I remembered that gesture from childhood homework sessions, from long car rides, from the night he taught me how to balance a checkbook. Seeing it now, recorded and distant, hurt in a quiet, piercing way. "The Aegis project," he said, "was designed to map and replicate rare biological resilience, immunity patterns, regenerative responses. They wanted control over what nature occasionally creates on its own. You are one of those rare occurrences, Lena. Not engineered, not owned, simply improbable." I had spent my life thinking I was ordinary, average height, average grades, average ambitions. And here was my father, telling me my existence itself had unsettled institutions powerful enough to erase reputations before breakfast. "They labeled you Subject 7B, he continued, "because numbers are easier to handle than daughters." I blinked hard, forcing the tears back. He deserved my attention, not my grief. "I tried to keep you invisible," he said, "but invisibility has an expiration date when data exists. If you're here, it means they've decided retrieval is no longer optional. And if they've framed you publicly, it means they want you isolated before they make you compliant." The word compliant scraped against my ears. "You have two paths," he said gently. "Run quietly and hope anonymity returns, or expose them, knowing the world will question you before it believes you." The video ended with him leaning forward, his expression softening into the smile he reserved only for private moments. "Whatever you choose," he whispered, "choose it as my daughter, not as their subject." The screen went black. For a long time, neither Julian nor I spoke. The hum of the computer sounded louder than before, like a distant engine. I became aware of the faint scent of dust warming under the monitor's vents. Small details, ordinary details. They grounded me while my inner world rearranged itself. "I'm not special," I murmured, almost pleading with the empty space. "I get tired. I forget birthdays." Julian's voice came softly from behind me. "Being rare doesn't mean being invincible. It just means being difficult to categorize." I wiped my cheeks with the heel of my palm, annoyed at my own tears. "They destroyed my name to get to my biology, yes. And they'll keep doing it, yes." The simplicity of his answers steadied me more than comfort would have. Comfort tries to soften reality. Truth simply stands there and waits for you to accept it. I opened the next folder. Documents, emails, financial trails connecting shell companies to research grants, grants to laboratories. My father had mapped it all with meticulous patience. It wasn't fantasy. It wasn't paranoia. It was accounting with consequences. "They didn't just watch me," I said quietly. "They built a system around people like me." Julian nodded. "And people like your father dismantled pieces of it." Quietly, I thought of his late nights, his distracted smiles, the way he sometimes looked at me as if memorizing my face. He hadn't been distant. He had been preparing. A sudden vibration echoed faintly above us, footsteps in the apartment overhead. Normal life continuing, unaware that beneath its floorboards, entire futures were being weighed like paperwork. "What happens if I release this?" I asked. Julian didn't answer immediately. He walked to the shelves and ran his finger along a row of binders, as if counting invisible years. "You become credible to some, Delusional to others, dangerous to those involved. Your privacy disappears. Your safety becomes negotiable. And if I don't, you remain a fugitive in public opinion. Easier to collect, easier to silence. There it was, not a choice between peace and chaos, a choice between two kinds of storms. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. The overhead light buzzed faintly. I remembered my father teaching me to ride a bicycle, how he had run beside me, one hand steady on the seat, until I was balanced enough to move alone. I hadn't realized when he let go. I had only realized I was moving forward. He had let go again. This time in a way that left no possibility of turning back. "I don't want revenge," I said finally. Julian's reflection appeared faintly in the darkened edge of the monitor. "Good, revenge clouds judgment. I want my name back," I added, "and I want them to stop deciding who gets to live quietly." His gaze softened. "That's justice." The word felt heavy, but right. Justice wasn't loud in my mind. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet correction of something tilted. A painting straightened on the wall. A distant siren wailed outside, faint but unmistakable. Julian's posture shifted instantly, subtle but alert. "They'll realize you didn't show up soon," he said. "And when they connect that to the missing footage gaps your father created, they'll start looking closer." "How much time do we have?" I asked. "Hours," he replied. "Maybe less." I looked again at the files, years of evidence condensed into folders and numbers. My father's life work reduced to megabytes. It felt fragile and powerful at the same time. I inserted a small flash drive from the desk drawer, my hands steadier now than they had been all morning. Copy, paste. Progress bars creeping forward like cautious footsteps. "Once this is out," Julian said quietly, "you won't be able to take it back. I know. The truth is, I wasn't thinking about heroism. I wasn't imagining headlines or speeches. I was thinking about the bakery bell chiming too loudly, about my aunt's Tuesday calls, about the red shoes by the door, about all the small, ordinary pieces of life that powerful people consider insignificant until they decide to take them. When the transfer finished, I held the flash drive between my fingers. It was light, ridiculously light for something that could tilt entire institutions. "Then we leave," Julian said. "Leave where? Somewhere they're not already expecting you to run." I almost smiled at that. The irony was gentle but real. As we climbed the ladder back into my apartment, I felt a weight of fear again, but it was different now. Before, it had been shapeless, like fog. Now it had edges, direction, purpose. I glanced once more at the hallway floor before closing the hatch. 4 years I had lived above a truth I never noticed. 4 years believing peace was simply the absence of conflict, not the presence of protection. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket. Upstairs, the morning light had brightened. The red shoes still waited by the door, polished and patient. I looked at them for a long moment, then chose my worn sneakers instead. Destiny, I realized, rarely arrives with elegance. It arrives asking you to walk. It arrives asking you to walk. The first thing I did after closing the hatch was make my bed. I know how that sounds, ridiculous even. But there is something about straightening sheets that makes the world feel briefly manageable. The fabric was still warm from sleep, faintly scented with lavender, and as I smoothed the wrinkles with my palms, I realized I might never return to this apartment the same way again. The thought didn't arrive like panic. It arrived like a quiet acknowledgement, the way you accept that summer will end even while the sun is still shining. Now, Julian stood near the door, giving me space without saying he was giving me space. He watched the hallway through the peephole every few minutes, his movements economical, practiced. Not nervous, prepared. "There is a difference. I need to call my aunt," I said suddenly. He didn't turn. "You can. But keep it brief, and say nothing unusual." I nodded, though my chest tightened at the idea of sounding normal when nothing was. I dialed her number with fingers that had typed thousands of work emails without trembling. She answered on the second ring. "Elena." "Elena." "I saw the news," she said immediately, worry spilling through the speaker. I could hear the clatter of dishes in her kitchen, the familiar domestic soundtrack of her mornings. "I know," I replied softly. "There's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding doesn't put your name on television," she said, her voice lowering. "Are you safe?" The question pierced deeper than I expected. Safe. I looked around my apartment, the fern on the balcony, the mug by the sink, the sunlight pooling on the carpet. It looked safe, it felt safe, and yet safety had already been compromised without a single broken window. "I'm okay," I said. Not a lie. Not entirely the truth. Just a sentence designed to keep her breathing evenly. "You can come here," she offered quickly. "You know that." I swallowed. The instinct to accept was strong, almost physical. Her home smelled like cinnamon and old books. Her spare room had quilts. She sewed herself. But bringing danger to her doorstep would turn comfort into guilt. "I might," I said gently. "I'll call you later." I hung up before my voice could betray me. Julian looked at me then, not questioning, just observing. "You're good at sounding calm." "I had practice," I said. "My father hated worry." He inclined his head slightly, as if that detail confirmed something he already believed. We packed lightly, not because we were minimalists, but because urgency teaches you what actually matters. A change of clothes, my father's photograph, the flash drive resting like a small secret in my pocket. I hesitated over the red shoes again, then left them where they were. Some things belong to a version of you that needs to stay behind. At 11:42 a.m., my phone vibrated with a notification that felt like a verdict. Helix Research names primary suspect in security breach. My name followed in bold letters. There is a peculiar numbness that comes when your identity becomes public property. It isn't the shock you expect. It's quieter. A hollowing out, like someone removed the furniture from your internal rooms without asking. I sat on the edge of the couch, reading the article twice, then a third time, absorbing how confidently strangers described actions I had never taken. "They've built the narrative," Julian said softly. "They've built a character," I corrected. "It just happens to wear my face." He handed me a small prepaid phone from his jacket pocket. "Use this when you release the files. Your number is already being tracked." I took it, turning it over in my hands. It was cheap, light, anonymous. The opposite of everything my life had been, labeled, documented, archived. The irony didn't escape me. "Where will we go?" I asked. "Not far," he said. "Distance isn't safety. Obscurity is." I almost smiled at that. My entire existence had been studied, charted, reduced to codes, and now my protection depended on becoming unremarkable again. A knock echoed faintly down the hall, not at my door. 2 apartments away. But my body reacted instantly, muscles tightening, breath shortening. Fear, I realized, is not always loud. Sometimes it's just the awareness that you can no longer afford ignorance. "Time," Julian murmured. We left through the back stairwell instead of the elevator. The metal railing was cool beneath my palm. Each step echoed with finality. I noticed absurd details, a scuff mark shaped like a crescent moon, the faint smell of cleaning chemicals, a flyer taped crookedly to the wall, advertising piano lessons. Ordinary things insisting on their existence while mine unwound. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Cars idled at lights. A woman laughed into her phone. A delivery truck rattled past. No one looked at me twice, and that, strangely, hurt more than recognition would have. The world doesn't stop when your name becomes a headline. It barely glances. We walked 2 blocks before Julian spoke again. "Once you release the files, there will be no returning to anonymity." "I don't want anonymity," I said. "I want accuracy." He glanced at me, a hint of respect softening his expression. "Accuracy is more disruptive than exposure." We ducked into a small cafe with chipped wooden tables and the comforting smell of burnt espresso. The bell above the door chimed too brightly. I chose a corner seat facing the window. Old habits, always seeing exits, entrances, reflections. I hadn't realized I had learned those habits from my father until now. I connected the prepaid phone to the cafe's public network. The files uploaded slowly, each percentage point ticking forward like a heartbeat. My reflection in the dark screen looked steadier than I felt. I thought of my father's final words. Choose it as my daughter. I wasn't choosing heroism. I wasn't choosing rebellion. I was choosing correction. When the upload finished, I pressed send. The action was small. A single tap. No fireworks. No applause. Just a digital ripple moving outward into a world that had already judged me without evidence. I exhaled slowly, surprised by the calm that followed. Fear didn't vanish. It simply changed shape, from something pressing down on me to something walking beside me. Julian checked his watch. It won't take long. For what? I asked. For them to realize the narrative slipped. We left the cafe before the first notification arrived. Timisic. I didn't look back at the table, at the empty cup, at the sunlight pooling on scratched wood. Some places belong to the moment you make a decision, not to the life that follows it. As we turned onto a quieter street, sirens sounded in the distance, not for me specifically. Not yet, but close enough to remind me that systems rarely surrender quietly. I felt the flash drive in my pocket, warm from my body heat, and understood that I wasn't running anymore. I was moving with intention. My reputation had been taken without permission. My privacy had been catalogued without consent. My ordinary life had been rearranged by people who would never know the smell of my aunt's kitchen or the comfort of worn sneakers. But my choice, this small, deliberate, irreversible choice, was finally mine. And for the first time since dawn, I didn't feel like a subject. I felt like a person reclaiming her name, one step at a time. The consequences did not arrive with explosions or shouting. They arrived with notifications. My pocket vibrated once, then again, then continuously. A swarm of digital insects announcing that the world had begun to look at me differently. We were walking along a narrow street lined with trees whose leaves whispered in the mild afternoon breeze. And yet my phone buzzed as if it were sitting on the center of a newsroom desk. I didn't check it immediately. There is a peculiar strength in delaying the moment you know will change everything. Julian noticed the restraint, but said nothing. He walked half a step ahead of me, eyes scanning reflections in shop windows more than the road itself. When I finally pulled the prepaid phone from my pocket, the first headline I saw was not an accusation. It was a question. Leaked files suggest corporate bio. Project tied to security breach narrative. The wording was cautious, almost polite. Journalists are careful when power is involved, but careful questions are often more They're adjusting, Julian murmured after glancing at the screen. I nodded slowly. The city around us continued its afternoon rhythm. A bicycle bell chimed. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve. The smell of roasted peanuts drifted from a street cart. Ordinary life moving forward while invisible structures shifted above it like tectonic plates. My personal phone rang then. My real phone. The one tied to my name, my billing address, my history. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Elena. Marissa's voice burst through, breathless. What did... I told the truth, I said quietly. There was a pause, filled with the distant murmur of office voices on her end. They're in meetings. Emergency meetings. It is going through everything. Security footage is disappearing. Disappearing, I repeated. Not deleted, she clarified. Just invalidated. They're saying the timestamps don't match. Elena, people are confused. Confusion. A softer word than outrage, but far more powerful. Outrage unites people. Confusion makes them ask questions. I didn't break anything, I told her. I only opened a door. I know, she whispered, and those two words meant more than she realized. Belief doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it only needs presence. We ended the call without promises. Promises require certainty, and certainty was a... By late afternoon, the narrative had fractured into multiple versions. Some outlets called me a whistleblower. Others called me a suspect manipulating sympathy. Online comments multiplied like reflections in a hall of mirrors, strangers debating my character as if it were public property. It was unsettling, yes, but also odd. Reputation, I realized, is just a story people agree to tell about you. Change the facts, and the story trembles. Julian guided us toward a modest public library, not to hide, but to sit. The smell of paper and dust wrapped around me like an old sweater. We chose a table near a window where sunlight filtered through leaves, casting shifting patterns across the wooden surface. I hadn't been in a library in years. The quiet felt almost sacred. "Public places are safer than empty ones," he said softly. "Because witnesses exist," I replied. "Because normalcy exists," he corrected. I opened the prepaid phone again. Legal analysts were now discussing the leaked documents. A former employee of a subsidiary company had posted a statement confirming certain project codes. The world wasn't defending me out of kindness. It was defending its own curiosity. Truth attracts attention not because it is noble, but because a message appeared from an unknown number. "Deal don't know what you've started." I stared at the words without responding. Threats, I realized, are often just admissions of fear wearing a mask. Julian noticed my stillness. "They'll try intimidation before negotiation." "I'm not negotiating," I said. He gave a faint, approving nod. "Good. Negotiation implies ownership." Hours passed, measured not by clocks but by updates. The organization behind Aegis released a statement, carefully worded, legally polished, denying wrongdoing while promising transparency. Transparency is a word. My aunt called again in the early evening. This time I answered with a steadier voice. "They're saying you uncovered something big," she said. Awe and worry braided together. "Are you in trouble?" "I was in trouble when I didn't know," I replied gently. "Now I'm just visible." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that settled deep inside me. "Your father would be proud, Elena. He always said you had a stubborn kind of honesty." Stubborn honesty. I smiled faintly. It sounded exactly like him, a compliment disguised as a personality flaw. When the call ended, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. Support doesn't erase danger, but it makes danger feel less lonely. By nightfall, the consequences became more tangible. News vans appeared near Helix Research. Social media timelines filled with document screenshots and amateur analyses. Lawyers began posting threads about corporate accountability. The world and attention, I learned, is a form of protection. We left the library as the sky deepened into indigo. Street lights flickered on one by one, small suns claiming their territory against the dark. I inhaled the cool air and realized something unexpected. I was no longer trembling. Fear had not vanished, but it had lost its authority. "They'll regroup," Julian said quietly as we walked. "Institutions don't fall overnight." "I don't need them to fall," I answered. "I just need them to stop pretending I don't exist." He glanced at me, a faint smile touching his lips. "Existence is the one thing they can't patent." The irony made me laugh softly, the first genuine laugh of the day. It sounded unfamiliar, like a voice returning after a long illness. My name was still circulating. My face still appeared beside headlines. But the tone had shifted. I was no longer solely the suspect. I was also the source. The narrative had widened, and in that widening I found space to breathe. Justice, I realized, is rarely dramatic. It is not thunder. It is erosion, slow, persistent, reshaping landscapes over time. The organization that had tried to reduce me to a code was now answering questions in front of cameras. Not because I was powerful, but because truth had become inconvenient to ignore. As we crossed a quiet intersection, I looked up at the night sky, a habit my father had taught me whenever decisions felt too large. "The sky reminds you you're small," he used to say, "but also that small things are part of something vast." I didn't feel small anymore. I felt placed. Like a puzzle piece that finally understood its edges, my life would not return to what it had been. The bakery bell, the Tuesday calls, the red shoes, they would all exist, but differently. Visibility changes the texture of ordinary days. But yet beneath the attention, beneath the headlines and debates, I remained the same person who watered her fern and remembered birthdays. Only now, I also remembered my own worth. And that, more than any public consequence, was the real shift, the quiet, irreversible reclaiming of my name from those who had tried to write it without my permission. Healing did not begin with silence. It began with exhaustion. 2 days after the files spread across every corner of the internet, After legal panels and late-night commentators and amateur detectives had all taken their turns speaking my name, my body simply slowed. Adrenaline, I learned, is borrowed energy, and eventually the lender comes to collect. Julien had arranged a small rented room on the edge of the city. Nothing luxurious, nothing hidden in a cinematic sense, just a second floor space above a closed tailor shop with pale yellow curtains and a mattress that creaked every time I shifted. Safety, at that point, wasn't about secrecy. It was about stillness. The first morning there, I woke to the smell of bread drifting up from the bakery 2 doors down. The scent was warm and ordinary, and for a moment I forgot everything. I lay there listening to pigeons shuffle on the window ledge, to the distant rumble of buses, to the rhythm of a world that did not revolve around my crisis. It was strangely comforting, the realization that the planet continues turning even when your personal axis tilts. Julien sat at the small table near the window, reading news updates on his phone. He looked less tense than before, though the alertness never truly left his shoulders. Protection, I realized, is not a switch you turn off. It is a habit you learn to carry lightly. Public interest is stabilizing, he said without looking up. That's good. Stabilizing sounds like people getting bored, I murmured. He glanced at me then. Boredom is safer than obsession. I smiled faintly. There was wisdom in that. Obsession devours. Boredom moves on. I spent that day doing things that felt almost ceremonial in their simplicity. I washed my hair slowly, noticing the scent of my shampoo as if it were a rare luxury. I folded my clothes with deliberate care. I called my aunt and let her talk about her neighbor's new dog for 15 uninterrupted minutes. Many ordinary actions became acts of reclamation, small reminders that my identity was not limited to headlines or leaked documents. The investigations had begun officially by then. Regulatory agencies announced inquiries. Former employees stepped forward with cautious statements. The Aegis project was no longer a whisper hidden in notebooks. I did not celebrate. Celebration felt premature, almost arrogant. Justice, as I had learned, moved slowly and without applause. What surprised me most was the letters. Emails at first, then handwritten envelopes forwarded through legal contacts. Strangers telling me about moments when institutions had dismissed their concerns. Parents. A retired nurse writing 3 full pages about how rare medical anomalies had always fascinated her. Their words were not praise, they were recognition. And recognition carries a quiet weight, the realization that your private decision echoed beyond your private life. One evening, I sat by the small window watching the sky shift. Julien brewed tea on a portable kettle, the faint hiss of boiling water filling the room. It smelled like chamomile and something floral I couldn't name. He handed me a cup without ceremony. "You're quieter," he observed. "I'm listening," I replied. "To what?" "Myself," I said after a pause. I didn't realize how loud fear was until it left. He nodded thoughtfully. Fear leaves echoes. I wrapped my fingers around the warm cup. So does courage. We didn't speak after that. The silence was comfortable, like 2 people sitting on opposite ends of a familiar couch. I realized then that Julien had shifted in my mind, from mysterious neighbor to steady presence. Not romantic, not dramatic, just reliable. And reliability, I had learned, is rarer than charm. Healing, I discovered, is not a single moment of relief. It is a series of permissions you grant yourself. Permission to laugh at something trivial. Permission to plan a future without flinching. I began making small plans again, not grand ambitions, just ordinary ones. Returning to work someday, though perhaps somewhere new. Visiting my aunt for a full weekend instead of hurried afternoons. Buying another pair of red shoes, not to replace the old ones, but to remind myself that choices still belong to me. The public consequences continued unfolding beyond my immediate reach. Executives resigned. Internal audits expanded. Statements grew more careful, more measured. The system that had tried to own me was now busy explaining itself. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced, like a scale that had. One afternoon I visited my father's grave alone. The cemetery smelled of cut grass and distant rain. I knelt, brushing a fallen leaf from the engraved letters of his name. For weeks, grief had felt like an open wound. Now it felt like a scar, still tender, but no longer bleeding. "You were right," I whispered. "I am your daughter." The wind stirred the trees above me, leaves whispering like distant applause. I didn't need signs or symbolism. The simple act of speaking aloud was enough. Closure isn't a door slamming shut. It's a door gently resting in its frame. On the walk back, I passed a small shoe store. In the window sat a pair of red flats, not identical to the ones by my apartment door, but close enough to stir a memory. I stood there for a long moment, watching my reflection overlap with the shoes. Then I stepped inside and bought them. Not because I needed them, because I wanted them. That distinction mattered more than I had ever realized. Later that evening, I placed the new shoes by the rented room's door. They looked almost defiant against the neutral carpet, a small declaration that my life was still mine to decorate, still mine to walk through. Julian noticed them and smiled slightly. "A reminder," I corrected. He inclined his head, understanding without asking more. Peace did not return as it had once existed. It returned differently, not as ignorance, but as awareness without panic. I knew more about the world's hidden structures than I ever wished to, but I also knew more about my own resilience. Knowledge had taken something from me, yes, but it had also given me a clearer sense of my own outline. I was no longer simply the woman who organized spreadsheets and watered ferns. I was the woman who had faced a system and refused to be reduced to a code. Mom. And yet I was still the woman who loved warm bread and Tuesday phone calls, and the quiet dignity of ordinary mornings. Healing, I realized, is not becoming someone new. It is remembering who you were before fear tried to rename you, and choosing to keep that name anyway. Sometimes people ask me if I'm brave. I always pause before answering, because bravery sounds like something loud, something with speeches and raised fists and dramatic music in the background. My experience wasn't like that. My experience was quiet. It was choosing not to wear the red shoes that morning. It was answering a phone call with a steady voice when my hands were shaking. It was pressing send on a file while sitting in a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and ordinary life. Bravery, I learned, is often just honesty that refuses to sit down. My life didn't return to what it was before. It couldn't, but it didn't shatter either. It reshaped itself. I still buy warm bread from corner bakeries. I still call my aunt on Tuesdays. I still water my plants and forget where I put my keys. The difference is that now, when I look in the mirror, I don't just see the person others describe. I see the person I chose to be when it mattered. There will always be systems bigger than us, voices louder than ours, stories written about us without permission. But there is one thing no institution can truly own: the moment we decide to stand in our own name and say, "This is who I am. This is what happened, and I will not disappear to make you comfortable." If you ever find yourself at a crossroads like I did, when silence feels safer but truth feels necessary, remember that your ordinary life is not small, it is precious. And it is worth protecting, even if protecting it means stepping into the light for a while. Tell me, if you were in my place, would you have stayed home that morning? Would you have opened the files? And if this story touched something in you, stay with me. Share your thoughts, because sometimes the courage we borrow from each other is exactly what carries us through our own quiet battles.